Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm David Mills, and it's a warm welcome from Oxford for this weekly Centre for Global Higher Education webinar. It's a real honour today to be welcoming Nelis Boshoff from Stellenbosch, from Crest, and Susanna Koch from Technical University of Munich for a webinar which is really thinking quite hard about how we might harness techniques from STS, including scientometric studies with more qualitative approaches to understand epistemic and inequalities in science. As always, we'll record this and we'll put it on our website tomorrow. Please do use the chat to ask thoughts and add questions. And after Nelis and Susanna have talked, we'll have the chance to reflect and join the conversation all together. I don't think I need to say any more. It's a real pleasure to have you. This is something which obviously is of real interest to me. I write a fair bit about African journal publishing and the challenges of inequalities in global science. So, Nelis, Susanna, the screen's all yours. Looking forward to this very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and good afternoon from my side or from our side. It's really a great opportunity to present today. Thanks for the invitation and to share insights from an ongoing research project in which we investigate inequalities in global science through a multi-method study focused on forest research. When I speak of we, just by the way, you can see my presentation or our presentation, right? All good? Okay, great.
It's fine. Yeah. You're muted, Susanna.
Okay, I changed the slide, but I in parallel muted myself, which was not an intention. But anyway,
it's fine,
when I speak of we, I mean this team of collaborators at the Technical University of Munich, at Stellenbosch University, Leiden University, and the Tanzania Forestry Research Institute. Our project has quite a long title. You can read it here. It is funded by the German Research Foundation, DFG, and it's currently in its final year. So it's also a good moment for us, so to say, to share insights from various different analyses we've been conducting as part of the study. When we started developing the project, we found that scholarship on inequalities in science was growing, but characterized by a sort of a significant disconnect between, on the one hand, large-scale bibliometric studies showing patterns of inequality, for instance, in authorship or collaboration, co-authorship patterns. And on the other hand, qualitative research highlighting experiences of inequalities in science at an individual level, so to say. And our ambition was to
You've done it again.
Sorry,
I'm really sorry.
I know. Yeah, the problem here is whenever my mouse moves. Okay, our ambition was actually to address this disconnect with a multi-method study that would link quantitative and qualitative approaches to reveal how these macro-level patterns relate with micro-level practices and how inequalities shape knowledge production in a particular field. And we decided to focus on forest research as an empirical case because on the one hand, the knowledge it provides has gained critical importance for actually quite a number of policy fields from national to international level. But also because the field is strongly stratified in terms of its actor composition, which manifests, for instance, at international conferences. And to empirically investigate why these inequalities persist and how they shape knowledge production, we draw on bibliometric, ethnographic, and comparative content analysis, which are conducted on the one hand by this joint aim, but also through a common or a joint theoretical lens, namely Bourdieu's sociology of science with the core notions of the field, capital, and habitus. So our perspective, so to say, rests on the basic understanding of science as a social field of struggles and relationships in which actors' positions depend on the one hand on the amount and types of capitals they have at their avail, but also on the habitus they perform, which can be understood as a sort of a practical sense of how to do science, which results from internalized structures and schemes of perceptions that orient their professional practice. And with that, I hand over to Nilius, who will show how we operationalize these notions for bibliometric analysis.
Thanks, Susanna. The next slide. Yes, as Susanna indicated, we work with the notion of capital, and there are four kinds of capital that we applied within our bibliometric analysis. So it was scientific capital, two kind forms there, products of knowledge, so acts of recognition, then collaboration capital and funding capital. Our research question when we started this work, when we work with bibliometrics, was to understand how the different forms of capital, how are they geographically distributed and also related. So we started out with a global mapping, a bibliometric mapping of inequalities through the bibliometric lens. And to do that, we had to operationalize the different forms of capital bibliometrically using indicators. And for each one of these, for each one of the dimensions, for forms, we had a number of indicators. The first one is publication. So obviously it will be publication contribution, the world share of forest publications. Some people might say when you talk about publications as a form of capital, it cannot just be the ordinary publication. It must be something more about the publication. Like, for instance, a publication in a particular kind of mainstream journal or publication that has attracted a particular number of citations. But we also need to remember in certain parts of the world, the mere fact of having a publication is already a form of capital. So we use that very generic sense of capital, looking at publication contribution, and then also try to contextualize it with what we call research disparity, where we calculate the disparity ratios between the world share of forest publications and the world share of forest, and that is the one I'm going to illustrate. But then we also have the other indicators. You can see the citation contribution, cross-regional collaboration, and then also funding, internal, external funding. We were also very cautious in the beginning, and also as we finalized this set of work, to not talk too much about dependency and independency, because specifically with funding and collaboration, it's not if you're too dependent or too independent, because we realize many of these things also serve as enabling capital. It enables people to do stuff. So we also try to have a different perspective on the forms of capital that we work with here. So I'm going to talk quickly, briefly about the research disparity indicator. So on the next slide, this is how we've operationalized it in one of the publications. And when the indicators on the previous page, some of them can be calculated for regions, others for countries, or for both regions and countries. In this particular case, this indicator, research disparity one, or maybe almost like a combination of indicators, it's calculated at the regional level, geographically at the regional level. So you have the different world regions like Central, Southern Asia, Europe, Latin America, Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. Then for each one of these regions, where you will see the world share of forestry publications. Here we relied on the dimensions database. So within a specified time period, we look at the total set of publications in forestry, and then what is the world share of each region to this total set of publications. And that you will see in the first percentage column, that's called column A here. So for instance, Eastern and Southeastern Asia, of which China is part, they're responsible for 24% of all the publications in forestry globally, Europe 40%, Sub-Saharan Africa 4%, for instance. And then the world average is 15%. Then the second column, the world ratio, it expresses each one of these percentages in terms of a ratio of the average. So when you can see, for instance, that in terms of the ratio for Europe, for instance, their share is 2.6 times higher, for instance, than the average for the world. And the same principle was also used in terms of the share of forest area. So what is also, I will say, a way forward when one engages with bibliometrics is to combine it with external data. So in this particular case, we use data from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, FAO, looking at the size of the forest areas in the different countries and regions. So in the same way, we can look at what is the distribution of forests in each one of the regions, the world ratio, and then in the last column, the disparity ratio, our actual indicator. So that is then the disparity between column A and column B. So if it's 1, it means that your world ratio, your world share of publications, it equals your world share of forests. So we work on the assumption that having more forests means there should be more research. But one can also think about it from another perspective. Maybe you need something more dynamic about the indicator. Maybe deforestation will also be an indicator that can be used here. So when the share of deforestation can also be used in these analyses. But what the disparity ratios, what it shows us is that East and Southeastern Asia, for instance, they produce a disparity ratio of 2, meaning twice as many publications in terms of shares as what we actually have forest areas. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, it's just the other way around. More share of forest, less share of forestry publications. So this is part of our first analysis. Many of these things you can read in one of the publications. But then, apart from working at the global level, we also looked at national or local levels. So that will be the next slide. And here, to use an example, Tanzania, we focused on Tanzania, an African country, and bibliometric analysis applied to local forest sites. So one of our first questions here was to know how is Tanzanian forest science represented in different bibliographic databases. With representation, we mean if you go into a database and you look at the database's classification of a field, what do you get? We not want to know whether all the publications from a particular country is being covered. We want to see what is the lens. If you enter a database through a particular lens, what do you have? So here we work with 4 databases: Dimension, Scopus, Web of Science, and OpenAlex. And each one of these databases, they classify forest science differently. For Web of Science and Scopus, for instance, they work with journal classification subjects. So they classify the journals, and then all articles in those journals, they consider to be forest science. For Dimension, it's classified at the article level, as well as for OpenAlex. And the time when we use OpenAlex, we still use the hierarchical classification system. So we've got 4 databases, 2 free mainstream, you can say, and then also an open, a big and open alternative to it. So having these 4 databases, our questions, for instance, will be, what is the degree of overlap among the 4 databases? Looking at the DOI, looking at article titles, how similar are, say, Dimension, Scopus, Web of Science, their representation to OpenAlex, which claims to have more. But then of more interest, I think is our last question, that 1.4. So apart from these 4 databases, we also put together a data set of local publications. In other words, Tanzanian publications, but you will not find in all these other databases, or that's one of the assumptions we wanted to test. So we looked at age-old mainly, but although some of them were also, a few articles were also collected through libraries in the country. But remember, age-old is not like Web of Science and Scopus, where there's an interface, you search for criteria, you get it. You first need to identify what journals in Tanzania could be relevant for forest science. And where you need to go into those articles using a list of keywords that we define and look for those articles. In one case, however, like the case of this one journal, Tanzanian Journal of Forestry and Nature Conservation, where we took all the articles in that journal. So in that way, we also put together a data set of local journal articles. And then the next slide, one of the last points, this is what we try to answer here. So if we add a data set of local articles, what is the unique contribution of, say, OpenAlex to this, as well as the local journals? If I say the this, I mean the totality. So we work on the assumption, if you take the different representations and you remove all the duplicates and you put them together, you get the total representation of forest science in Tanzania. So what will be the share of the contribution of Open Alex to this, as well as the contribution of the local journals? And that you can see there on the bars. So Open Alex, it contributes 64% to the total pool, and the local journal 16%. This will be only Open Alex or only the local journals. But if you look at it differently, you look at the different databases or different data sets in that green tabular component. So if you go to dimensions, 150 articles were considered forestry based on the representation. 22% of those are exclusive to dimensions. In other words, it doesn't appear in any of the other databases. Local journals, 88% only appeared in the local journals. Open Alex, 86% only in Open Alex. Scopus, 31% unique, and Web of Science, 3% unique. So it gives us an idea of how well Tanzanian forest science is being represented in these international databases, also considering the local journals. The next slide, please. But because we're linking this to content analysis, we had to look at the content of articles. So that allowed us to do something else that you seldom see. This is if a database classifies an article as Tanzanian forest science. In other words, the author is from Tanzania and is sitting in a forest science classification. Does it mean that it is focused on forest science? Because if it's classified in forest science, it doesn't mean it is forest science. So two people went through all the articles and classified their content. And what we discovered is that you will see there in the display, large shares is actually not forest science. If you combine the databases, it's 43% not forest science. Open Alex got a large percentage, 47, Scopus 27, etc. The local journals also, but that is basically because of that Tanzanian Journal of Forestry and Nature Conservation. So it's more of a nature conservation part there, that is not the forest. Because we do a content analysis, I think I explain now the purpose of the content analysis. It means if we want to work with the core set of Tanzanian forest science, where the focus is also on Tanzania, it's only the part in yellow there that you see in the bars that we will work with, where it's about forest science and it's about Tanzanian forest science. Because having a Tanzanian author doesn't mean it will work on Tanzanian forest science. It can be international global forest science or forestry in Nigeria, etc. So this is what we have been, and then the next slide. So what we try to do here through content analysis is to see what you find in the databases, how it's classified, how does it relate to certain epistemic, let's call it epistemic elements or knowledge aspects. So we classify that as a what or a where. So, but for this we need external information again. So we need information from Tanzania about its national research programs, about its national forest tenure system, about the national forest types, etc. So someone classified all the articles, the pool that we selected, and see what national research program is being focused on in the article, what national forest type is being highlighted, what national geographic region, etc. for all 5 databases. And then on the next slide, here's just one example for the National Research Program. So what you see there on the left, we see national research programs. This is how it's classified, the programs in a Tanzanian policy document from the government authorities. This is what it is. Then we've got a national budget allocation because we needed some benchmarks about the relative, let's call it importance or relative prioritization of these different national programs. So you will see the shares there of the budget allocation, and then you will see the next column, percentage of research. So of all the research, combining it for all the 5 databases, this is what the percentage distribution look like. So you can see, for instance, that sustainable harvesting and utilization of forest resources as a topic, national budget but 21%, but only 9% of all the research focus on that. Whereas for management of natural forest and biodiversity conservation, there's a large concentration of research, 54%, but in terms of the budgetary allocation, it's only 18%. In the same way, we've also done it for the different databases, because people usually argue that local journals represent something that you will not find in the mainstream databases. So we also wanted to see, specifically for OpenAlex or the local journals, does it introduce a different perspective? We don't see it here always in the data. And then my last slide, some of the follow-up work that will happen soon, because currently we have an article data set. We want to convert it into authors, because we want to see if your authors got different collaboration patterns, like no collaboration or national only, international only, or mixed, do they change in terms of where their preference is for research that they actually publish? What research program do they focus on? What forest tenure system, etc.? And this is important because if you look at the overall bibliometric analysis at the global level, collaboration is the enabling capital. In sub-Saharan Africa, large shares of researchers in forest science, they actually collaborate with other people. At this point, Susanna is going to take over more qualitative analysis about collaboration. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Niels. As Niels just mentioned, international research collaboration is usually seen, especially from African perspectives, as an enabling type of capital due to the scarce funding, so to say, context African scholars operate in. However, there's more and more research also showing that international collaboration is also a site of inequality, reproducing asymmetric relations between scholars in the global north and the global south, as for instance highlighted by this Nature editorial you see on the slide, and also evidenced by studies from bibliometrics to interview-based studies, survey-based studies, and more ethnographic analysis. And the crucial question there is, there are more and more actually policies and guidelines in place, also from funder side, that seek to so to say, outline the conditions for equitable partnerships. And we know that research collaborations have these internal inequalities, and still they persist. And the question is why? We try to address this with a praxeological, thanks Niels, study that had in focus 6 African European research projects on forests. So we interviewed scholars involved in these collaborations and also did participant observations of their collaborative meetings. We did this based on the presumption that we saw these research collaborations, so to say, as microspaces of scientific fields, and meetings as spaces where actor relations are generated, deployed, resisted, or also possibly transformed through discursive interaction. All the 6 projects we studied had a focus on forest governance topics, and they received funding from Europe. What they had differential features, namely on the one hand the type of the funder and the what we call design collaboration order, by which we mean, so to say, the formal roles and actor relations as set out in project proposals or official project documents. And in existing literature, actually these formal actor constellations are emphasized as very important, especially in this whole development discourse. There is a lot of emphasis put on the need to put scholars from the global south into lead positions in such collaborations to enable locally driven and demand-led research. However, in our study then, we found that actually the design collaboration order was not necessarily decisive for how the collaboration was practiced. In fact, we found that irrespective of this formal setup, unequal roles and differential scientific authority emerged in the practice of the collaborations. And I will give you some empirical insights, starting with the eucalyptus project, which, so to say, was quite a progressive project in our sample, because it really had on paper, so to say, African scholars in the lead. A person called Habitus, an African professor, performed the role of the overall project PI. And there were 2 African senior scientists at different institutions in his country. They supervised 5 African PhD students, and then there were also 3 professors from Europe involved, who, however, had, so to say, in the project documents, the roles of being co-work package leads and co-supervisors. When we observed a core meeting of them, a face-to-face workshop at the African University of Addis, we however found that one of the European professors, whom we call Trend, really performed a sort of a lead role in the scientific discussions, meaning that he performed large parts of the moderation. He, throughout the week, he constantly evaluated the quality, validity, sufficiency of the data collected by the African colleagues, interpreted these, and suggested how to move ahead with the research. So very indicative is this statement you can read on the slide. You guys are getting great data. Let's get it on paper and make it something scientific. When we shared our impression that Trent had a sort of a strong role during these discussions in the interview with others, the formal project PI. He reacted quite strongly and kind of listed all the things he had done and decided without Trent, like, for instance, selecting the PhD researchers, organizing this workshop. But then he ended his narrative saying, but we work together. I cannot make any decision alone. I have to ask Trent and say, I want to do this. Is this okay? Yeah, this is okay. Or no, don't do this, do this. So this reflects sort of a different actor relation than what you could actually read in the formal project documents. And this can be, however, understood if you understand from which positions and with which stakes the professors entered this collaboration. So the process was that the African scientists indeed jointly developed the first sketch of the proposal, but then in a second stage of the application needed to get professors or scientists from the funding country on board of the project. They reached out to Trent and his colleagues, whereby Trent, he's really a key figure in the field, highly prolific, highly cited, and with collaborative ties across the world. And Trent and his European colleagues, they decided to support the project, but as it turned out in the interviews, not primarily for economic or epistemic reasons, but more due to a history of prior relations with Addis University, and they wanted to support a South-led project, although, as they said it in the interview, they saw the risk of ending up writing papers that were not the most interesting ones. So that's how they put it. So the collaborators here really kind of entered this project with different stakes, and we argue that the perception of these differential stakes and positions generated an emerging collaboration order that clearly differed from the designed one. And we found very similar patterns across the projects in our sample, irrespective, as I said, of the formal setup. And I would just want to give you a second example from the Acacia project, which was led by a consortium of scholars in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And in that project, also a European professor whom we call Marta had really a similar lead role, taking over moderations in most of the meetings we observed and doing the overall coordination, giving overall directions, making assessments and final decisions, as you can also read on the observation vignettes on the slide. These vignettes extracts are from a face-to-face workshop of this project in also taking place at an African university hosted by Benjamin, who was formerly one of the co-PIs of the project. And he opened this meeting, but soon after, Marta kind of took over the lead. And again, it's, one can understand, or it's insightful to see Benjamin's position in that project and how he positioned himself during the interview. We asked Benjamin how he came to be involved in that project, and he explained to us that they got approached by Marta and another colleague from this consortium because they needed someone from his country. And then when we asked what motivated him to get involved, he said, oh, because of many things, because of the great opportunity. And then he listed a number of things which motivated him, like the opportunity to do research on forests in his own country, for which he usually scarcely has or doesn't have funding. The funding and prestige coming with this project, which for him, or he framed it as a first of its kind at his faculty, but also the chance to collaborate with people like Marta, who have a great experience. So this prospect of the social and scientific capital coming with this project. And it was then interesting because we also asked, well, how they, after forming the consortium, how they developed this proposal together. And it was very insightful because he described it as follows. Of course, the proposal, Marta was leading the writing of the proposal, but she wanted us to give that feedback, participate in how to formulate, for example, the research question, asking information if they are missing, if it's correct. So we did some kind of workshop, but of course, Marta was the one who wrote all the proposal. And this was also a pleasure to see Marta, because you know, Marta, when I was doing my PhD, Marta is one of the authors that I cite a lot in my thesis. And then in the course of the interview, he again repeatedly said how wonderful it was to get in touch with this key figure called Marta. And so this made us understand that Marta's dominant role in this project seemed kind of taken for granted by Benjamin, which then also was reflected in the fact, resulted in the fact that he actually hardly challenged her or raised issues. For instance, the fact that the project publications in English, like English language scientific articles, would be actually of little value to the Francophone society he worked in. So at the very end of the interview, we asked about his publication preferences, actually irrespective now or unrelated to the project, but he came back to the project and gave us a very long narrative on the tensions resulting from the publication activities in the project, where you said, well, you do research, you take those from the people, and then they are not able to read it. That's the problem. I know in the project we should work in English, but the country concerned by the project, people are generally French speakers. From now, I didn't bring this question to the table with Marta, but it's something, it's always in my mind. So here, this is also one example that reflects that in that project, Benjamin's positioning towards Marta, also her positioning towards the other collaborators, altogether kind of reproduced differential roles and relations which differed from the design collaboration order you would see on the project webpage or the proposal. And which kind of reproduces this sort of asymmetric role distribution between African scholars as the executing experts on the ground and the Europeans being the ones who lead and direct the research in terms of theorization and interpretation of findings. And we found it quite remarkable that actually almost none of our interviews problematized the emerging division of tasks in the context of the projects they were involved in. Quite the contrary, they kind of normalized them in the interview as reflected in this, of course, Marta was the one writing the proposal. And with Bourdieusian theory, we would argue that this is now exactly how this habitus, like the internalization of structures, comes to its effect and reproduces these sort of asymmetric relations in international research collaborations. I could just give you really a snapshot of these findings, but you can read them in the publication that has just come out in March this year in Minerva. Also, you're, of course, warmly welcome to have a look at the project webpage, where you also find the bibliometric analysis Niels has been talking about. And please get in touch if you're working on similar or related issues. And we are very much looking forward now to your comments and questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Susanna and Nelius. That was really interesting, and you gave us an awful lot of rich quant and qual material there to think with. So thank you again. I'll start while I'm waiting for others to comment in the chat. Please do add your comments in the chat or raise your hand if you have a thought. I guess what was really interesting about your work is how hard it is to sort of make numbers have real meaning, and what you're trying to do here is look beyond the numbers of where the journals are cited, where they're being published, to actually trying to go upstream right to the start, isn't it? To, of the relationships that well before the publications come out. So my question, I guess, for Susanna probably is, I mean, it sounds to me like what you're encountering was another form of capital, which was sort of informal geographical capital, or even whiteness as capital, or somehow Eurocentricity as capital, in that there was a deferentialism towards the European collaborators. Was that around expertise? Was that around performance of authority? I mean, how would you begin to explore that? It's a really difficult thing to explore, but it cuts to the heart of it, doesn't it? Because that's sort of where even if the PI is the African PI and they're the first author, you're not necessarily getting at the sort of hidden capitals that are going on within the system. So that's my question for you, Susanna. And then my question really for Nelius, looking at the quants, is what's interesting about the local journals, I guess, is that they're being far less cited, aren't they? So it would be interesting to look at which forestry research is being cited and why. In proportion to global forestry research, how often is Tanzanian research cited and influential within the broader field? But that would get at this question you raised at the start about the capital of publication visibility. I guess that was the point. Anyway, yeah. So there's just two questions to get you started.
Thanks a lot, David. Nelius, should I go first, or yeah? Yeah, I mean, we struggled also a bit with kind of finding the right notion for this sort of, capital you just referred to, because I think in the paper, we do refer to this geographical space, right? And making this difference between, scholars located in Europe and Africa. But of course, it's not meant to be geographical in terms of only, the geography, but it's more a sort of being at the socio-epistemic center of science, right? Versus being located at the peripheries, or depending on the perspective, of course, from which you argue, right? But from a global science system, the peripheral location of global science, which of course has different conditions also of funding, economic capital, collaborative capital in terms of the networks you're involved in. So we felt all of this comes together when, this African PI, he and his colleagues, they developed the idea. They had a research idea, and they were actually the ones submitting the proposal as lead applicants, right? But then in this emerging collaboration order, it really felt like they ascribed the lead authority, right, to kind of position the project in international scholarship and finding the cutting edge theorization, right, that they themselves ascribed it to the European collaborators, right, to push that forward. And the European collaborators, on the other hand, also said, well, the African colleagues, they are the ones, they know all about the context, they know all about the place. So also they localize them in a way, right? And interestingly enough, both sides perceived it as mutually beneficial, right? That all partners brought specific benefits to that project, but then, in the practice of the collaboration, they kind of ended up in roles which are actually highly criticized as kind of, reproducing the colonial structures.
That's really interesting. I think that notion of localizing knowledge is we're all trying to do, but if you're someone else is localizing you, then it's much harder to speak to the general. And I think that's absolutely right. I think so then inevitably the African collaborators, because they somehow have the local expertise, can't do the global. Yeah, thank you, Susanna. Yeah. Nellis.
Yes, when one talks about local journals in relation to recognition or visibility of them being cited, then it's obviously what people have in mind when they talk about that is how it's being cited in the mainstream journals. Because it happens that the big citation databases, they are built around the mainstream, but there are also alternatives now being opened for that, alternatives that are actually challenging this. But one needs to remember a local journal, local article, they might serve other functions in terms of visibility, which might not be necessarily the function of being cited in the broader mainstream collections. It could be that a local journal, typically because of all the problems associated with being part of the mainstream, could be more accessible, for instance, to a particular researcher's students, for instance, because the things that matter to the students, it is visible because it's published in a local journal the students can access, and they can actually relate it in the work. If it's published in a mainstream one, it might be lost for that student community because they cannot access it. So it's about the function that it serves, but when it also opens this whole kind of argument, open alternative ideas for actual analyses that can also be linked to more conceptual issues. And one of these issues is about integration or inclusion in a scientific community. Then immediately the question will be, what scientific community do you speak about? Because one can have local scientific communities in a field or outside that field even, and also the more global mainstream. So having these different databases like OpenAlex, why we're also interested in that, because the local journals, they're sometimes not so accessible. But if they are captured in OpenAlex, there will be a way for people to access it, and then also to start to look at these communities. And I think that is quite an important thing, to start to work with alternative scientific communities and see how people also overlap among the different communities. Thanks.
Brilliant. Yes, no, that's really helpful. So just a clarification, by local, you're meaning Tanzanian journals, like Tanzanian affiliated journals, yeah? And
Yes.
Obviously OpenAlex will have some Tanzanian journals in there, yeah? But was your search for the local, were those the ones that weren't in OpenAlex? So you're supplementing OpenAlex. Is that how you found those?
We look at them independently. Remember, we look at each database independently. But if a local journal is not in OpenAlex, it sounds very strange what I'm going to say now. It doesn't mean it's not in OpenAlex.
Yes.
Because we use the OpenAlex representation of forest science to look for it. It can very well be in OpenAlex, but sitting under environmental science or entomology or something totally different. So that will be analysis of coverage, but we're interested in the representation. Thanks.
Good. Okay. Well, we got loads of questions coming in now. So I'm going to ask Federico if you'd like to unmute and ask your question first.
Good morning.
Morning.
So,
Hi, welcome.
it was a very simple question about funding. So if you reflected more like deeply on how the funding stream affects the role that African scientists believe they have to play in this project, because it's not just that they submit a proposal, but they submit a proposal, they are the PIs, but it is a German British institution. So the British and the German PIs also have a closer relationship to the money, and that's, I think it's even more important that some of the prestige or expertise factors that may come in the discussion.
Very interesting question.
Yeah, thanks, Federico. I mean, the funding obviously is a crucial factor in that sense that it enables the whole collaboration, right? And in fact, the closeness of the European partners to the funding institution was also mentioned a lot as actually being beneficial for the whole team, because, for instance, in that project, in the Eucalyptus project, I shared with Trent and others. Trent had a lot of experience with that specific funding organization, right? So he was also, the African colleagues also said, well, you know, he's experienced, he knows what the funder wants, right? He knows the processes, he can negotiate with them. He has a kind of a direct line in terms of at one point they discussed an extension of the project and so on. So here, yes, I would fully agree. There is a dynamic that is related to the funding, but what nonetheless surprised me was then how much that impacts, obviously all together in an intermingled way, the scientific discussions. Because I mean, you could say once the project is secured, you have the funding, right? Usually, in many European projects, the project is approved, then you might have a midterm report and an end-term report, but it's not that you are constantly being evaluated. So you could say they secured the funding, and then, you know, they can have scientific discussions at eye level, or even then with the African scholars in the lead in terms of the, you know, interpretation of findings and so on. But then, obviously, that was, this shifted, these roles shifted in the course of the implementation. We did in the beginning try to find actually also projects with African funding, like international collaborations with African funding, to exactly look at, you know, how much maybe this factor influences the whole thing. But even though we really did a lot of research and tried to find a project, we didn't succeed. There is not even a project where you said it's in a collaboration and only the African part is funded and the European brings their own. But it seems all the international, like the European African collaborations, if they exist, they are funded by Europe, and otherwise there's no collaboration. So that made it a bit difficult indeed. But I think it's more than only the funding, right?
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Federico. That's really helpful. Got a few more questions coming in here. Mauricio, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, I'm also Argentinian as Federico, I guess.
It's great to have Argentinians. You're very thoughtful on science. It's great. Welcome.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your presentation. I don't know if my question is going to be clear enough, but I was wondering, probably I missed some part of the presentation, but when you describe the habitus in the interactions, could you observe in your research some institutional condition like norms or practices, or even we could say like scientific culture? I don't know if the research allow you to make an observation beyond those interactions. If you see locally in that institutions, you see any conditions that you could ascribe or make a relation with the formation of the habitus. I don't know, it was more or less clear.
Yeah, I think beyond the collaboration as such, it already starts with this idea that, for instance, it's more valuable to do your PhD or postdoc in Europe than in, you know, any of either in your own African country or in a neighboring country. So and not only because of the funding, again, of course, funding is a core aspect, right? But also because of the prestige and this perception that it's kind of more reputed, more valuable. It gives you more capitals, of different sorts, if you do your qualification or stages of your academic career in the global north, because again, you are then in the socio-epistemic center of science, right? And it starts with, for instance, it really reflects also in the interview narratives where people, I remember one person saying, well, yeah, many of my colleagues, they went to Uganda, they went to Tanzania, but I was privileged enough to go to Wales. Yeah, and this is like, you know, the language that is being used. It was not only like, okay, I got funding, this is because I went to Wales, but I was privileged enough to go to Wales. Yeah, and so I think this is really, you know, this internalized structure that shapes the ideal of your scientific career, being, you know, some or at least a part of it in the global north, where the center of science is imagined, you know, to happen or to be. even though, and then I close this answer, but even though, and that was really interesting, when we spoke in the interview more about, the individual ambitions, or what are your ambition as scholar, how do you see the main value of your research? Actually, the scholars elaborated a lot on how they want to support their own societies, right? And how they want to work with their communities and give back to their communities. And there you have this discrepancy, because, when you come to Germany and work at home, well, you don't necessarily, interact with your community anymore. And it's also very questionable when you then publish in wherever Minerva, how much that serves the benefit of your community living in the forest. So these tensions between the ideals of, your scientific career and the capitals that, you have as a prospect when you go to the global north, they conflict with your individual ambitions as a scholar in your own society.
That's great, Susanna, thank you. And nothing wrong with Wales, but it doesn't have many forests, I don't think. Daniel, you had your hand up a couple of times. Do you want to come in?
Yes, I thank you so much for the presentation, and Bishop, thank you so much for the last time we had a chat, and then here we are. You accepted to present at the CG HE. My question is that number one, there are bits and pieces, and also my observation. Number one is that those published in local journals, are there international collaborators on those publications in the local journals, and could that be saying something? Number two, we're talking about it as, yes, it is unequal, but my question is that, do researchers in Africa collaborating with researchers in the global north feel that they are in an inferior position? Do they feel so, or it is our assumption? Do they see it that way, or they feel that yes, it is equal for us, I'm okay the way it is? And number two, we have for so long blamed global north for African science and African research culture, in my view. What is the role of the African universities in this? What is the role of African governments in this? What is the role of funders in Africa in this? Obviously, we will say, yeah, there's not much funding coming from us. What is our research culture? How what are we doing? Well, I am an African. I come from Ghana, but I'm studying at the University of Oxford. I think that we have far too long blamed global north and making it look so problematic. I do not see so. I disagree, because I want us to own our own narrative and ask ourselves, what are we doing? What are we failing to do? And what do we need to do best, so that we end the blame game? Else you don't expect the UK government to come and fund your research for you and perhaps expect you to drive the narrative. No. If your government is not funding research, if your government does not see the need to pump money into it, it becomes a big problem. Now the last thing is that what is shaping, or what is determining Africans not collaborating among themselves and collaborating more? Obviously funding. Beyond that, what is why do we not see more collaboration in there? I can go on and on, because I'm passionate about that.
That's fine, Daniel. Daniel, you've shown your passion. I don't know whether Susanna and Nellis can answer the big normative questions, but they certainly can answer the questions around perceptions of inequality and well, over to you, Susanna and Nellis.
Yes, I'll try to answer some of them. I cannot answer all of them. The first one about the local journal publications in Tanzania, where there are also international collaboration on it. This is exactly what we want to do now with the follow-up, to see how the type of collaboration actually influence what you decide to focus on. So this is exactly what we want to do, and then we will be able to answer that one. The second one about, I think it was around feeling inferior or not. I think I'm not in a position to answer that one, so I will rather leave that one. But first, the last two were actually both related. It relates to funding. The first one is about African governments taking ownership, and the ownership, a key one, is in terms of funding. Because if you have invest the funding, you can also decide on the topics. You can decide what is relevant and what we look at the alignment with national research priorities. And then the last question, why do we see so little local collaboration, also relates to funding to some extent.
Absolutely.
Because the
Absolutely.
projects are funded internationally, and specifically in the medical science and other fields, it put together with large teams, where the African and the researchers from the global south were part of international teams. So funding determines also the collaboration structure. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nellis. Money talks. Susanna, do you want to add anything?
I can only maybe add something or an insight regarding this perception of inferior. I mean, this notion of feeling inferior did never appear somewhere, and we didn't work with it. What I raised at the end of my talk was, or my part of the talk was, that we were kind of surprised how little, as I said, this whole differential roles were problematized by the collaborators themselves, even when some of the projects were themselves concerned with inequality, or even some of the scholars, you know, had experience with post-colonial studies and so on. That was very interesting. And as I said, many actually said, well, we see it, but for us, it's nonetheless beneficial, right? So we see the inequality, so to say, in terms of our roles, but nonetheless, we gain something from this. So we continue. And I mean, that's fair. You know, that is fine. It's not on our side to judge on that, but it's just an explanation why, you know, when you have all this critique of in publication patterns, yeah, you have the Europeans as first authors, or like the theorizing, you know, it's the locus of theorizing remains in the global north, so to say. You know, there you have a sort of an explanation how these different or inequalities persist. Yeah, even though you have more and more attempts actually and critique of these prevailing structures.
Brilliant. That's really interesting, and I think that's a really helpful answer, in that if somehow the system works in a strange sort of way for everyone in it, and therefore it carries on. And we're not necessarily making these big sweeping critiques of the North, but just trying to articulate what's going on in what seems to be unequal relations. We've only got a couple minutes more, and we have two last questions. Yasmin, you also asked the question in the Q&A box. Would you like to ask it now? And then also, Glenn, you had a final comment as well. Yasmin first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for such a detailed presentation. I really appreciated how you walked us through, you know, the layered of process of combining the bibliometric analysis with the content analysis, like to refine the data set. I'm actually not from forestry background, but I'm here actually to understand how different disciplines are measuring the inequity. So how you are conceptualizing the measurement of inequalities. So you mentioned that you used bibliometric, ethnography, content analysis. So given this different level of analysis, I was curious, like, how did you ensure the consistency across these methods when you are like focusing on an inequality? And also just I'm curious, like, did you find any example where this collaboration in research that you are calling the collaboration habitus led to any equitable outcome? You know, we are focusing on inequality, I know, but whether this somehow produce any equitable outcome. Thank you so much. Thank you.
They're great questions. Thank you, Yasmin, very much. Should we just quickly take Glenn? Do you want to add that question you were posing about capitals as well?
Thank you very much, David. Congratulations on the great presentation that you made. It definitely engaged us and got us thinking. But in terms of optimizing the results of your research endeavor, which of the capitals do you see trending or emerging or being identified as crucial or predominant as the takeaways for future researchers to come into the field, to do similar studies? What would be predominant trends that they should be looking for? Okay,
great. That's perfect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, if you can wrap up in a couple of minutes, that'd be great. Susanne, Nellis?
Okay, maybe I leave the most difficult one for Nilius and take the easier one. In terms of the consistency of data, let's say in our project proposal, the data were more consistent than during the implementation, because we found, the different work packages were related. For instance, we identified interviewees also through the bibliometrics, right, from the bibliometric data set. But just to give you an insight of one challenge, you find a highly prolific author in the bibliometric data set, you contact the person and the person replies to you, oh, thanks for contacting me, but I'm actually not a forest researcher. Even though in the, in your data set, the bibliometric one, this person appears as a core author. Yeah, so this is challenges that emerge in such a multi-method study. We will hopefully publish at the end of the project one paper on these methodological issues. Second one, the equitable outcomes. We had one project where the formal setup was a setup which would be super criticized in terms of, Europeans the lead, Europeans getting the funding, Europeans being the coordinators, and the African ones being kind of, the implementing scholars on the ground. This is how it looks like formally. But here in that project, we saw really the African ones driving this whole thing. And it was because of the specific professors being very aware, having been in Europe, having accumulated a social and scientific capital himself that enabled him, so to say, to ignore that in terms of the funding capital, economic capital, he didn't have much, but for him, the scientific and social capital he had acquired throughout his career put him in a position where he could really drive his own agenda, and he wasn't dependent scientifically on these collaborators. Now the trending question to Nilius.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I will answer it in this way. I think also from a bibliometric perspective, there are things that I know, or probably we know at the back of our heads, it's important, but it's so difficult to measure. I would say currently, if I need to say of all these capitals, which one is the most important, I will say funding capital. But you see, funding capital didn't come to its full right in our analysis, simply because bibliometrically, what's available to do it in terms of funding, it's not there.
我刚才报那个法邮件，我刚才法邮件报名那个东北大学论坛的时候，那个同学描绘比较靠谱。对这种。
Sorry, I had someone unmuted. Sorry, finish what you were saying. Apologies.
Yes. I think it's funding, but we need a specific study around funding, because you need to collect the funding data, because funding will have a strong relation to collaboration, to publications based on the networks you establish through that, but also the citations for communities that you embedded in. So I think everything funding is sitting underneath it, but you need more dedicated studies also for the funding. And that will be my takeaway message. Thanks.
Brilliant. Yeah. So most of the time, money does most of the talking. Occasionally, age and wisdom trumps money, but not often. That seems to be an analysis that perhaps holds here. You've given us a really interesting presentation, Nellis, and you've shown us quite how we can link these really different methods together and put them to use. It's great to see so many publications coming out of this project, and I think you'll be able to find them. We'll put the slides up tomorrow. Do send me your slides so we can put them up with the recording. We'll have more talks on this sort of topic of STS and research, because it's such an important question for understanding the inequalities in global science. But for today, thank you all for coming, everyone. Thank you all for your questions. Really enjoyed your questions and thoughts. And next week, we're still in Africa, but looking at Nigeria and disability in universities. So come back next week. Thanks again. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for joining. Thanks a lot.